Here's a question for you folks. What have you done to lower the carbon footprint of your websites? If you've not been doing anything, have no fear. Our next speaker is here to help. Taken to the stage, next up at the 2021 CityJS conference is Tim from Paris in France. Tim is a Nuxt.js ambassador, and in this talk, Tim is going to be doing one thing and one thing only. Helping you make more sustainable choices in your choice of technologies to build websites with. Simple. Personally speaking, I think this is possibly the most important talk of the day, so please do pay attention, perk up your ears, and give this one your full attention. If you have any questions for Tim which crop up over the course of this talk, please do save them up for our Q&A session, which will be starting on GatherTown immediately after this talk, as well as post along on social media using the hashtag CityJS2021 and keep those comments rolling in wherever you are watching along at home. For now though, Tim, it is my pleasure, honor and privilege to hand the stage over to you.
Hello and welcome to my talk at the CityJS Conf of 2021. In this talk, we will be talking about, I said talk a lot there. We will be talking about how you can build a website that has a low carbon emissions output, right? So low carbon websites. And so in fancy terms, it's like how to make more sustainable choices in the production of web technology. Because you might think this is not that big of a deal, right? But actually the internet is a huge consumer of electricity and energy, and therefore is emitting a whole bunch of CO2. And this video is really, or this talk is really a guide for you, the developer, to figure out what you can do within the constraints of your job to actually be better for the environment. And then Unagi. You will most likely get Unagi. This is Ross from France, who feels like he has Unagi, the state of awareness of everything. He obviously doesn't have that, but for that you will have to watch the episode. But I thought that was fitting for this talk. Anyways, my name is Tim. You can find me on Twitter on this handle. I am Dutch, but I live in France. And so if you hear a weird accent mix, that's where that comes from. I am a principal developer advocate at Uniform. I literally just started, so I'm really excited about that. And then next to that, I am also a media developer expert at Cloudinary, and I am an ambassador at Nuxt. And I've worked with those companies, both of them, for many years, and I'm really happy I get to represent them here. So if you're interested in that, have a look at their websites. They do cool stuff. I also like to do a bunch of conference talking, such as this talk. I wish we could do it on bigger stages or actually with people, but right now we'll just stick with this, which is fun as well. You know, I get to buy a nice microphone and a good light and stuff like that. I also make videos. So if what you hear in this talk is in any shape or form interesting to you, please consider subscribing. Of course, you don't have to. It would be nice for me and maybe also for you for future content that you might be interested in. So let's get this train on the road or on the train tracks. I butchered that. Anyways, let's look at some statistics, because it might not seem at this point in time in this talk that the internet consumes too much and that you don't know what to do with it. But let's look at some numbers, because they are staggering. Right, so if the internet was a country, it would be the world's 6th biggest polluter.
Oh my God!
So when I did a bit of research for this talk and, you know, the bigger subject of this, that was my reaction as well, because that's huge, right? So the internet consumes 466 terawatt hours per year. And these are numbers from a couple of years ago. So I'm assuming it's actually more now. And this number might not mean that much to you right now, but let's compare it to the UK. That only consumes 300 terawatt hours per year. Imagine how big that is, right? So at the moment, and this is already way better than years ago, the average website produces 1.76 grams of CO2 per page view. And how this is calculated, we will talk about a little bit later. So you get a bit more of a grasp on how these numbers actually came to be. But if you have these numbers for a website with 10,000 visitors each month, that's 211 kilograms of CO2 per year. That's a whole bunch of trees. And then think about how many websites there are. These are staggering numbers, as I said before. But don't worry, we can do a bunch of stuff about that for you as a developer. I have some tips and tricks that can actually make this way better. Because like my website is way lower than this. I'll show you in a sec. Right, so let's kick it off for real now. This is kind of how websitecarbon.com is calculating it. Afterwards, if you want to know more, actually go to that URL below. I don't know where they'll edit this in, but you'll find the URL. So they look at data transfer over the wire per page load. They look at the energy intensity of web data. If you want to actually know more about what that means, just go to that link and actually read it. They look at the energy sources used by the data centers, like is it green or not, things like that. Then, of course, they had to figure out the carbon intensity of electricity itself, because there's all these different ways of creating electricity. So what is the carbon intensity of it to make an average rounding number? And then, of course, how busy is your website? And that's actually it, really short. And go to the URL and to actually figure out more about that. So now let's talk about what you as a web developer can actually do to make your website much better for the environment. And we have 3 areas of interest. Number 1 is UX and design. So I won't go too deep into this subject because this is a JavaScript conference, right? But there's a pretty big chunk of what you can do as a developer in UX and design and accessibility and things like that to make the website consume less. And I'll talk about why, of course, when we start the chapter. Then we have front-end development best practices, and those are mainly to do with performance and how much data goes over the wire. And then we have the digital experience platform architecture. Wow, that's a mouthful, right? So a DXP, we'll talk about what that is. And if you don't know now, just wait for it. But in average, it's more a DXP is kind of an architecture that has a bunch of tools together that makes the platform that is a website. And you can have many different types of architectures of different tools together that actually are much better for the environment. So we'll get there as well. So that's for your full stack people. All right, first things first. How is your website? Like you probably have your own website or some projects, right? So how would they impact the planet? So when this talk is done, go to websitecarbon.com and put it in and just check yourself, right? So don't do that now. Stay here because we're going to do mine at the moment, right? So let's have a look. Here it goes. So it's loading. I did it before, so it's pretty fast. So my site is faster than 85%. It only has 0.21 grams of CO2. But as you can see above a little bit, it had bad energy for my hosting. So I kind of have to fix that. But so my website needs 2 trees per year to absorb the energy. And mine is actually pretty good. But imagine if it's not, how many trees you'd need. That's pretty bad. So let's talk about the things you can actually
Look, I drew a sketch of how we're going to do it, okay? Rach, that's you. That's the couch.
Ooh, what's that?
Oh, that's me.
Well, that's actually how a lot of designers and UX people are kind of, and then with developers, of course, looking at how to build a website and structure its content and things like that. And I thought that this moment was actually kind of fun. And you know what? The scene after this, where they shout pivot, is probably the best scene of Friends, like in the whole series. Anyways, I could talk about that for a while. I'm not gonna. So you know what? Shitty accessibility and UX are actually a huge offender for websites with a high carbon footprint. And so if you use them well, you can really lower that carbon footprint, right? Because imagine if your page is really easy to find and it's really too easy to understand how to get from point A to point B once you're on the website, people really just use their device a lot less. Servers are pinged a lot less. Screens are open a lot less, right? So you will get a lower carbon footprint by having a great SEO, great usability, great accessibility, because the flow is much shorter, right? In the end, what you want to do on an e-commerce is sell something. If you put all the right things in place, you can lower your carbon footprint by a bunch, right? So convey the message in as little content as possible.
You know, whipped. Whoop-a! It's not whipped. Whipped is whoosh. That's what I did. Whoop-a!
This actually might rival the previous scene, because this one is also really fun. And I put that in because we kind of, as developers, when we have all this information I'm going to talk about, we kind of have to whip in place our colleagues to also understand this and figure out the best UX and, you know, user flows. And so that's where the whipping comes from. Anyways, but you always hear this one, but I want to engage my users as long as possible. So are you Facebook? Not likely, right? And if you are not Facebook, I'll just let Joey explain to you why it's just not that important, right? To keep people long.
Right? Because if he doesn't like you, this is all a moot point.
Huh. A moo point?
Yeah. It's like a cow's opinion. You know, it just doesn't matter. It's moo.
Right? If you are not Facebook and you want to sell something, just do good UX. You don't need to keep people, right? And I know your boss likely gave you this goal, or, you know, the business opportunities or the business goals that we have generally are like that. I know we have to start changing at one point, but for now that's not true. So I understand. I've been working at agencies my whole career. I've been there. I know. So at least if this is the case, let's follow the best practices for development that we're going to talk about now, because that will really, even though it doesn't get you the most benefit, but it gets you a very, very long way, right? So a rough tool to cover the basics to figure out where you stand with your website is just running Lighthouse, because it gives you a bunch of best practices, accessibility stuff, performance goals. It's not as refined and super specific of what you need, but this will cover like 95%. So it's all good. Just run an audit and see where you are, right? So let's talk about accessibility for a bit. What you can do about accessibility as a web developer that really makes the website easier to navigate for everybody is to actually just make sure that you practice inclusive design. And even if you don't have the opportunity to talk to your UX people, to the design people, you can do a lot yourself to make that website more accessible for everybody. And therefore, it takes less time to use it and people don't get frustrated and have to try 4 more times, right? So make sure that if you cannot be compliant to the actual rules with the design also and contrast ratios and things like that, just make sure you're code compliant. Run tests and make sure that you're A or AA, right? And make sure, that's another one, to have everything relative. And so this means EMs, RAMs, percentages, things like that. And you might not think about this, but a lot of users that use Firefox that need assistance actually scale the interface to, let's say, 300%. But Firefox doesn't always scale everything if it's pixels. Because it's so specific and cool to do stuff for people with accessibility needs, that sometimes out of the box, it doesn't do exactly what you need. And so to make sure that everything zooms properly, use EM values or RAM values, because if your media queries are not with percentages or RAMs, but the rest is, you're going to have a pretty bad time, right? So make sure everything is like that. So you probably don't realize that so many people use your website as a mobile interface because they zoom to 300% and use their keyboard. That's like a really often used system. Right, so be aware of that. Okay, that was really short because the biggest accessibility stuff is more in the UX and the user flow for this case, right, for low carbon emissions. So let's talk SEO. So there's all these basics, and I know a lot of you will probably just know them, so I'm just going to run over them relatively fast. So make sure you have a canonical URL. Make sure you have, of course, proper title and description. Make sure your sitemap is correct. Have schema.org rich data. Use the proper OG tags for when you share something, that you can actually know exactly what's shared. Because if that tells the user exactly what you need to do or what that page does, you click and you buy, right? That's what you want to be doing. Correct information. Don't have errors, right? Use secure connections. Use correct HTML, and that goes with the correct page outline. And you know what? These sound like such basic things, but I see them go wrong. Basically, every website that goes live that I've worked on has an issue with one of those. What if we didn't have those issues and Google would always find exactly what we want, right? Because we have good content and we have good tech. Because this is not about the content. This is about technology. This is you guys. You can solve this. What if you solved this and you didn't have any of those headaches, right? That's what we're here for. So let's look at more like web dev best practices, not just SEO kind of KPI kind of stuff, right? So actually performance has a huge impact also on the carbon footprint, because less data over the wire generally gives you better performance. If the browser has to load less things, even if you have HTTP2 with multiplexing, header compressions, things like that, more to load is still more energy consumed by the device, even if the browser is really efficient at it. And, like I said before, about 3 years ago, one normal page had an average of 4 grams of CO2 emissions. And nowadays it's 1.75, which is already way better, because we all understood that performance leads to better click-through rates, conversions, things like that. But it's actually also really good for carbon emissions, or less carbon emissions. So what are the biggest offenders here? And I already hear your brains spring, like going and spinning, and like, oh yeah, it's probably like observer things, or like scroll behavior and listeners and things like that. You know what? I wish it was that easy, because those things are relatively simple for us devs to actually go into and change those scroll listeners and things like that. But you know what? The biggest offenders are actually the things we cannot really control a lot. It's actually the third-party libraries, the embeds, the media assets, the JavaScript old school personalization files with like all variations in a JS file loading on the page, changing your DOM, third-party libraries that actually embed themselves but do that very slowly. Like, this is the stuff we cannot really control because, the business needs them. That's the hardest bit, right? So generally those third parties are poorly optimized. Nowadays it's a bit better, but a lot of those bigger third parties that everybody has to use aren't as optimized, right? They might actually not use green hosting. They might have their own hosting platform that you cannot control, right? So the biggest thing you can do is eliminate bloat. We'll have that in the top, right? This is one of the subjects. So remove as many third-party dependencies as possible. And if you cannot do that, lazy load them, but we'll talk about that in a sec, right? So do you actually need all of Lodash or jQuery or Modernizer or Moment.js? And I know I spoke about some old stuff and some new stuff in there, or relatively new stuff, because if you are a third-party video player, you might not need React to render that video player. It's not likely that you need that, right? So it goes for a whole bunch of different scopes of that. You probably don't need these tools. If you're just a good developer, most of those tools are not needed, right? So, but what if you have to use a library? Just make sure it supports like the ES6 imports and exports, right? Because Webpack and tree shaking and hoisting of variables, that's pure magic. That's what we need. And to a lot of this audience, you'll be like, dude, obviously. But you know what? A lot of those third-party libraries are just not like that, because they were built, let's say, 3 years ago for an enterprise client. And they just kept on slamming features in, but not thinking about just the things you see on the slide here, even though for us that's pretty normal, right? But just make sure you're aware of those differences, right? And kind of fun is that Google Tag Manager and those really old school JavaScript personalization engines, they are by far the worst. And for Google, Tag Manager itself is pretty optimized because it's on so many websites, they have to. But what actually happens is that Google Tag Manager hosts a whole bunch of other systems that make everything slow. And then for the JS personalization, not the fancy new stuff. for example, where I work at Uniform, that's super fast. But the old stuff, where you basically get a file that's loaded on every page that has like 500 kilobytes of DOM in it, and it finds a gap in the DOM where to attach itself, and it just injects something based on your persona. Why would you load those 500 kilobytes plus an extra library to manipulate DOM, right? Those still exist. There's a lot of them, and they're terrible. And so those kind of things are something you have to try to eliminate, if not
I'm wearing everything you own.
right? That's what those personalization engines do, or what Google Tag Manager does. You don't need all those clothes, but it puts them all on because it can, right? And so generally, I'm not here to badmouth marketing people, but it's their job to add features to their digital experience platform stack to do marketing like things like personalization, like A/B testing, like analytics, like all that kind of stuff, right? But without actually knowing, they are bloating your website and making it really bad for low carbon emissions or high carbon emissions, whatever.
All right, I don't want to alarm anybody, but Monica's hair is twice as big as it was when we landed.
This is a nice one because we always used to deliver a website and it was like super fast, slick, exactly what we wanted. And then 3 months later, through Google Tag Manager, a whole bunch of things were added. And then you get Monica's hair. That's what you get. So, controversial opinion, here we go. I feel like I get to say this because I have a bunch of experience building websites, but let's say, right? So most brands only use about 5% of those Google Tag Manager analytics. So is it worth the bloat in the bigger scope of things? Likely not. So, try to not have this stuff. On to the next, progressive enhancement. And so progressive enhancement is something that fits in a whole different array of work. It can be from CSS to JavaScript to content. And the point with progressive enhancement is that you start very simple, right? A website or an app that you build works everywhere. And as simple as in, internet is a feature, touch is a feature, JavaScript is a feature. What if you didn't have those because you're a refrigerator? Your app still needs to work. And then each time there's a new feature that you detect, you add a new bunch of code for that can leverage that feature, right? That way, your app will work anywhere. And based on the features that it finds on the device that it's using, more stuff happens. And at the end, when you're on Google Chrome on your fancy Android phone, suddenly everything works, right? So that's kind of the approach that I think you should be having, because you also have graceful degradation, which is basically you build your blue sky fish and everything is amazing. You build everything in and then you realize, oh, this browser doesn't do that properly, or this phone doesn't have that. So let's add some code to make it not happen. And you probably know where I'm going with this, right? Because progressive enhancement has less code and therefore has a lower carbon footprint. And this is also just a best practice, like mobile first, start like that, content first. Now, content first actually thinks about having no internet or no touch or things like that. And if you do that properly, you just need less code to get where you want to be. So this is a hard one because it's not easy to build this kind of stuff, but keep it in mind. And then another one that's also huge, right? Optimize your media. But we all know, or we might think we know, but managing images and videos is not that easy, right? It's not just slapping a PNG on a page and call it a day. That's no longer sufficient because those files are huge, and that costs a lot of energy and download time, so more time over the wire, right? So the concept of managing it is fairly simple, right? So we optimize an asset to have the smallest file size, to the correct file type, and the correct resolution. And of course, you do this for each context the image is used in, because at one point it can be a big hero banner, and another point it might be a little product tile where it's also there. That might be the same image, but it's a different context, so it needs to have a different file type maybe, or different resolution, things like that. And file type, I mean an AFIF or a WebP or something like that based on the device of the user, right? That's also context, because an iPhone is a different context than my desktop that I'm recording this on right now. So it seems like in reality we almost are incapable of just delivering images properly. But if you compare this to the fact that Google can do Google Stadia, even though it might be dying, we don't know. If you can pull off Google Stadia 4K video stream with low input lag, but we cannot just put a simple image on an e-commerce website, like, why is it so hard? And we kind of have to deal with this stuff, because if there's only one thing you can do to make your website a lower carbon emission website, it is to optimize your image assets. Because nobody will notice if the quality remains the same, but the images are less heavy, you have less carbon emissions. So if there's one thing you do this one, right? So you can try to DIY, your own pipeline, like, oh, this is a JPEG, and what can I do for optimization? What are my standard policies for quality and bit depth and things like that? You can do it. I've been there. I have worked on those things, but it's really, really hard. It's expensive, time consuming. So just use a platform that already has done all its homework, right? There are all these third-party SaaS platforms out there. Even CDNs just give this to you out of the box, right? So look around you and use the right tool, and they're not that expensive. And it's much less expensive than doing your own tooling. Next, lazy load all the things. And why would you load something if a user doesn't need it? That all costs bandwidth. It costs energy, right? You have to render something on the screen that the user thinks is useless, right? So don't waste resources. Things like if you have a big mega menu, right, on your desktop website, and if you open it, there's a bunch of images or videos in the mega menu. This happens with all these fancy luxury websites that I work on. That happens all the time. It's not very likely that a user will open that mega menu, because generally they do a Google search, or they're on Facebook or Instagram. They click on a link because they knew what they wanted to find. They go to the product page and click buy. That's the average way people come in as a user journey. So if you then start to load all those 55 images in your mega menu that they will never open, that's just wasteful, right? And that makes your carbon emissions go sky high.
Do we dare?
We dare.
The only relevance of this clip to what we're just talking about is that these chairs are called lazy boys. And anyways, so lazy load all the things. So I'm not just talking images, right? You can lazy load an image. It's relatively easy now. You even have lazy equals true, or loading equals lazy. I'm sorry. You can do that for videos and iframes and stuff, but you can do it with way more things. Like imagine you have a ratings and reviews third-party embed, right? So you have your product, you scroll down, and suddenly you have ratings and reviews or comment section, things like that. Why don't you just load that third-party library the moment the user scrolls down? Because most likely they won't scroll down, and then you don't have to load that whole huge third-party library that starts rendering stuff in your DOM and using your processor and such. If you don't need that, don't load it, right? So those are excellent examples. Or another one, like, why would you embed a YouTube video if people might not click on that play button? Just use an image with a play button on it, and when they click, only then embed it. That's also lazy loading. And those things are not hard to do, and they're very interesting to work with. So these are things you as a developer can just do without nobody knowing, right? You don't have to talk to your business analyst about this. You just do it because you're a good developer, right? However, be aware of GDPR, because sometimes you need to have something in some JSON object before you send it to Google, for example. You cannot just lazy load Google Tag Manager or there's all these kind of rules around GDPR where lazy loading is not always good, because those cookies need to be on the page so to accept them, or there's a bunch of stuff you should figure out if you start doing this.
All right, check out this bad boy. 12 megabytes of RAM, 500 megabyte hard drive, built-in spreadsheet capabilities, and a modem that transmits at over 28,000 BPS.
So he just listed out his fancy architecture, but then, of course, in his 1993 laptop. So let's talk about digital experience platform architecture and making the right choices to be in a low carbon field, let's say. Right? So our current model is pretty bad for the environment. Right. So before we talk about why, let's talk about what a digital experience platform actually is, because it's such a fancy term. And basically, DXPs have been around for quite a while. They combine multiple tools to create a platform. Right. So, and generally they provide context for the user, but also for the content editor or the marketer for the full platform. So a DXP is much more than just your website. It's also other things. And generally, those other things are chosen by marketers, right? So marketers really like stuff like, of course, content management, newsletters and services around that, digital asset management for campaigns and videos, and of course, personalization, A/B testing, CRM stuff, analytics, a whole bunch of stuff that marketers like, but are not actually just your headless CMS and your Jamstack website or your normal website. There's a bunch more stuff that makes this a thing that works, right? Your full digital experience platform. And traditionally, those systems are created by one suite of tools, right? Adobe AEM or Acquia with Drupal or WordPress. They do all these things for you. Right? So a bit like this. There's a user with a website and everything is one big box. And there are some issues with this because they are expensive. Performance is not as good as having like best of breed tools. You have, for security, there's a bunch of issues because there's so much surface area to attack. But actually what we should talk about is scalability and power consumption, because the thing is, those monolithical systems, those big systems are always on because they are not decoupled, right? So if you have your wish list and your search and your homepage and all of that in one tool and you want to scale your wish list a lot, you have to scale everything, which means more power consumption, not so good for the environment, right? So we kind of have like this Jamstack to the rescue here. And you don't do Jamstack for all websites, but for a lot of them, right? And so this is a very simple, like I like Vue.js, so I have put Nuxt in here. But the whole thing is that on the build step, like nowadays we kind of know Jamstack, right? But I'll go over it very quickly. In the build step, we do everything dynamic. We fetch all the stuff we need. We create one static website and put that on the CDN edge. And from there, the user interacts with that. And so most websites that we build can just run on that, even if they're dynamic, because you can just add some SaaS providers, like some other components to your DXP where you do AJAX calls to, or use them on build level, right? The headless CMS, the identity providers, things like that. And so when you look at the Jamstack DXP that I have in mind, you don't need like Adobe AEM to do all the things you see on the screen here. We can actually just keep going, and we have Cloudflare. We can use Azure pipelines, Lambda functions. We can use Next.js or Nuxt, or we can use Edge workers if we want for on-the-fly server-side generation of your static files. We can use Contentful as a CMS and personalization with Uniform and on, right? So all of this combined lives behind that stuff that you render on the edge. So there is no origin, which means there's no always on servers anymore. If something is on, it's because it's doing something. But if you don't use it, it turns itself off, or you pay less, or right. So kind of this is my favorite slide of the deck where we have traditional DXP and modern Jamstack DXP. It grew hair. How about that? Right. So what is super important is to orchestrate that Jamstack DXP. You should use maybe serverless functions or microservices and make them stateless and stupid, which means if they are stateless and stupid, they have one input and one output. So when you call them, they turn on, do something, turn off. If you never use them, you don't pay for them, they don't consume energy. And where I work at Uniform, we actually deal with the orchestration of all of that. So if you're interested, you go to uniform.dev to figure that out and see what we're doing. And, connect everything up and profit, basically. But as a last bit, because I know I can see that we're at 34 minutes. We're almost too far. There is a big elephant in the room here. Of course, all those server parks where those CDNs live, right? They have a lot of servers. They all consume power. They all need cooling. They need security. They need backups. There's so much stuff going on, right? And so what you need to be doing is choose a hosting partner and a CDN that is actively trying to have a low carbon footprint. And I know that's not always possible because there are servers consuming stuff. So what a bunch of those companies do is that, like in other areas of their company, they try to go carbon negative, so they balance out. That is kind of how they do it, right? So I would try, and this is hard, but as a developer, persuade your clients to actually try and find green hosting. So let's conclude. It wasn't that hard, right? I kind of took all the open doors that I could find and put them in one slide deck. There we go. So follow general UX and SEO guidelines for best practices. Follow performance guidelines, right? Reduce your bloat. Deal with media assets correctly and choose the right architecture that is at the most low carbon that you can get. And then, of course, all of that combined with a green host will get you really far. And you can probably not do all of those in your current project, but if you just did one, you did a really good thing for our green earth, right? So I really want to thank you for watching those 36 minutes, pretty long. You can find me on Twitter and of course also on YouTube. So if you enjoyed this and if you enjoy similar content, please visit my channel and subscribe. Anyways, that's it for now. Thank you very much for watching and I'll enjoy the conference. Cheers.
Wow, Tim, that was a brilliant talk. Thank you very much for delivering it as part of this year's conference. Personally speaking, I don't think there's anything more important than this topic as a developer community for us to tackle and do our best to reduce our CO2 footprint. And speaking of which, I think it's only fair that we challenge the CityJS Conf web development team to reduce their CO2 output for every single page load to below 1 gram of CO2. We'll see at the next event whether they manage to pass that challenge or not. Anyway, please join me in giving Tim a huge round the world round of applause. If you've got any questions for Tim about his talk and about how we as developers can reduce our impact on the environment through our day-to-day work, why not join our Q&A session in Gathertown right now, or post on Twitter your questions for Tim using the hashtag CityJS2021, and as always, keep your comments rolling in on YouTube.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Tim, for that amazing talk.
Thank you.
Super, super important topic. And I'm really glad that, you were able to speak to us about this today. Those stats that you mentioned were staggering and they were just for 10,000 websites, but we're increasingly things are moving online. So we're going to have, millions of websites and billions in the next few years. So this is, yeah.
And those numbers weren't even that new. I'm worried that it's way worse now than it is when I got those numbers.
Yeah, exactly. So no, really happy that you're here.
Thanks.
And just a reminder to everyone, please post your any questions that you have in the chat, and we'll ask Tim them. So I'll kick us off with a question. Obviously, there are so many different aspects to sustainability and web development, and I guess it's a pretty nascent topic, and not too many kind of standards have been produced yet. And like you say, things are difficult to quantify. No one really knows, to be honest, how much power they're using. So, do you think the future of this is to develop some kind of standards like we have for core web vitals, Do we need something similar for sustainability, sustainable websites? Yeah, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, that's a really complicated question and really wide-ranging. And I think it's an awesome question as well. And you know what? I wish this would be there. I wouldn't know how that looks yet, because if you saw the talk, it's kind of a collection of open doors that I'm kicking open, right? Like a lot of things we know, but there are so many facets to it that it's almost impossible to make, you know, a quantification of this is good and this is not so good. It's just very easy to see what is really bad. But even the model I used to figure out how many, you know, grams of carbon emission I was having on my website is just one company with one website that figured that out. They did well, but it's really challenging. And so it took a long time for Core Web Vitals to come out, and it had to be Google fueled by SEO related ranking things to make this happen. There's also a bit of good behind it, because a fast website is clearly better for the environment than a slow website.
Yeah.
But still, it's going to be pretty hard, right? Because even if your Core Web Vital score is really good, you can still lazy load a lot of things in the background, right? And the antenna on your device is still going to be running, it's still going to consume energy.
Yeah.
So just making the Core Web Vitals work is not the answer, not yet. And so if there are so many things that are hard to quantify, the best thing is to just follow the best practices of the web and just use less, right? Have better UX, use less stuff on the site, like trackers and whatever you want, right? Those kind of things. And optimize as much as you can, and then hope for the best. That's almost what I can tell you right now. Because
Yeah.
I wouldn't even know if we have a KPI on a project for, you know, sustainability. I wouldn't know how to measure. Not yet.
Yeah. Well, on that, actually, you know, is there any kind of concrete tips that you can give developers who are listening today, you know, around what they can kind of do to make their websites more sustainable?
Well, I would say if you are a developer and you work at some agency and you have a pretty big site you're working on, you cannot just always convince the stakeholders to say, change this all up. You might get a no, because there are business goals and there's all of this stuff going on, right? And so what I would suggest, if you're a developer in a team right now and you want to do something, but you cannot do that much, which is kind of the normal approach, or like the most happening approach there is just make sure you lazy load as much as you can. And because if you lazy load, there will be a lot less data going over the wire, and therefore you will have a lower carbon footprint, because you can always see like those big mega menu, like those flyouts, right? And a lot of websites I've had to build, it's always with images inside and a whole bunch of fancy stuff. But likely when a user came from Google and they found just one product page, let's say, they're not going to open that menu. So don't load anything inside of it.
Yeah.
So that's the one bit, right? Lazy load everything you can, but that also goes for third parties and iframes. And if you have a YouTube embed, for example, don't just do an iframe, because YouTube will just load it, even if you don't actually click play on the video. Just have an image, and when you click on that image, where's a little play button, then it renders the iframe and then it loads it in. Because most likely a lot of people are not going to click on that video, right? So don't load it.
Yeah.
So
True.
those kind of things make a lot of changes in the carbon footprint. And then images are huge as well, right? If you have an FF file or you have a PNG, it's pretty different. And incidentally, doing all those things also makes your experience of the website better, right? So it's kind of nice and fun how that goes hand in hand.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you have the elephant in the room, which is kind of like the architecture. Because if you work with a big monolithical system, like a suite approach, it generally is based on an origin server. Even if there's a bit of CDN, you always have to go back to the origin to get information. And this means that server is always on. And it's generally a collection of things that are always on, because it's one big product. I'm not naming names here. There's no need for that. But you probably all know kind of what kind of websites these are, or systems these are, right? And generally it has a user system inside, there's e-commerce inside, there's CMS inside, there's a front end built in, it's templating, stuff like that.
Yeah.
these things are always on and consume energy. And if you want to scale one part of it, because maybe come Christmas, people use your wish list a lot, you have to scale the whole thing, and it all consumes more energy. And so the easier way to do that is actually have a composable architecture, right? To have everything headless and just connect the things together. Because generally those do have their own CDN, but if you don't actually use them, you don't hit that server, and it doesn't at least um, use your traffic. It might use other traffic. So it's really challenging to really make it good for carbon emissions. But at least if you compose a system, there are less things that you can put together, and it's actually just much easier for carbon emissions, but also for your mind. And you have freedom, right? If you want to change one part, you just change it. If you want to scale one part, you just scale it. So it's good for multiple things, but in the end, it also lowers your carbon emission.
Yeah, I think that's the really key thing, that all these things that you mentioned, they're not only good for reducing carbon emissions, they also help your website run more efficiently.
Exactly. That's not a bad thing to have, right?
Yeah, exactly. Everyone wants that. And ultimately it leads, like you say, to better conversion rates. If you've built your website more efficiently, actually you're getting people faster to where they need to be quicker, then they'll hopefully convert better as well.
It all goes hand in hand. And what's quite interesting is, like, I'm also seeing some stuff here in the chat where Andre, for example, is asking about, can you check JavaScript functions if they are fired more often and maybe create new panes on the page and stuff? Yes, you can definitely do that. You can do a lot with that. The thing is, that's changes in the margins. And if your website is already super optimized and everything is awesome, then go there. But don't, because this is a JavaScript conference, so everybody's really good at JavaScript here. If you start thinking about thread execution and how things are, if you're doing things on the window or if it's a scoped variable, of course, these things matter, right? Especially in a single page app, but it's going to give you 2% of optimization. If you put in an image fix and lazy loading, we're talking 80% better. So that's why I didn't really focus on those super tiny details about JavaScript, even though they're really interesting and I love going there, just not for this general subject.
Makes sense. So we have another question from Andre, actually.
Cool.
He said, you mentioned that you fought off third-party scripts before. Do you have a solution design reference? Solution design reference contains a list of web analytics used, their meaning, and a contact person for that third-party provider.
I'm just trying to figure out what I could answer to this. So a design reference here, would that mean one way to do it, or how to talk to someone who doesn't want to get rid of them? Or I might not completely understand the question. I can talk about third parties in general if you want. Maybe that's an easier one.
That would be useful for everyone, I think.
Sure. So what I've seen, and I like that wasn't really said here in this talk, but I have been a web developer for many, many years. And up until recently, I was director of web development at a global agency. So we see stuff at scale. And those things at scale, we're talking projects with 600 websites, things that kind of scale. And so what we see is they all have Google Tag Manager. They all have some sort of personalization engine on the client side. They all have some sort of A/B testing on the client side. And then, for example, the Google Tag Manager, they put in a lot of extra things that are all these cool marketing tools, right? To figure out metrics, but also to change the website. And the funny thing is, this is my experience. So this is not always the truth, but in my experience, all those tools are great, but they're only utilized for, let's say, 5%. Like the true power of getting everything together requires you to be, hyper mature in what you want for your brand story on a website. And it's just really hard to get there. Like companies like Amazon and Facebook, they are there, right? Because they have daily sales or daily usage in Twitter. Like they know exactly if we change this thing, that happens. 80, maybe 99% of websites are not there, even if you're a huge brand. You just want an online presence. And then when you add all that stuff into it and you don't really use it, it's bad for everybody. And so I kind of advocate for know what you want, have an MVP, minimum viable product for just what you need, and implement that, but make sure you can grow into it.
Mm,
So it's almost progressive enhancement, but for features, right?
mm, yeah.
So if you do graceful degradation that we do now, we have all the stuff in there, and if we don't use it, we add some extra stuff so it doesn't. So you can lazy load it, for example. That's an extra feature on top. But if you just don't have it, you don't need to code the lazy load stuff,
Yeah. It's a great
right?
point.
It's kind of funny, right? How that happens. And so what I think we should do is have a common language for people who do the marketing stuff and people who are developers like us.
Mm,
If we understand together how this works and we can work together on tools that are super simple to integrate, it's much, much better for everybody and the environment on top of that.
yeah, for sure. Simple is better.
So uh, I could have just said that. How about that?
We have another question from David.
Oh.
Do you have any videos or tutorials with examples on how to do these things in your YouTube channel or blog?
I do have a whole bunch of content on both of those. Not always very specifically to this, but I do have videos about lazy loading images. I do have videos how to reduce your bundle size in Nuxt, right? I have some Nuxt merch here. Like all of those kind of things. So if you feel like going through, you can go to my website, which is timbenniks.dev, DEV, or on YouTube, just find my name. You will see a whole bunch of videos about performance and best practices, not specifically for lowering your carbon emissions, because there are so many subjects. If I now choose one and feel like that's the most important one, I will underserve all the other ones. So I haven't really done that specifically. However, this does give me an idea about maybe making a series, about
Yeah.
low carbon emissions and figuring out if you do this, that will happen. If you do this, we can make some sort of series there.
That'd be
I
great.
just started a Core Web Vitals series, for example, because come like May 21st,
Yeah.
Google will put this in play, and website and the ranking, everything is going to change based on Core Web Vitals. And in my experience, a lot of people don't know how it works. Even though they think they do, there are so many variations.
Yeah.
And what happens in a single page app for first input delay, like this kind of stuff, nobody really knows.
Yeah.
And so
Sure.
I am doing a series now each week or every 2 weeks, like another subject within that. So I might do that for green energy or low carbon websites. It's a
Yeah.
good idea.
Do.
I like it.
It's a great idea.
More work for me. I like it.
Yay. Awesome. I think we are going to need to wrap up now. But thank you so much again, Tim, for this really enlightening talk and all your great answers to our questions. Hopefully, yeah, see you very soon again, giving another talk, and I'm going to
Cool.
watch out for your video series.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was awesome. Feel free to subscribe to YouTube so you get all the videos and stuff.
Yes, we'll do. And that's your name, right? Your YouTube channel.
Yeah, it's just youtube.com/TimBenniks.
Awesome. And to all the audience, please go check out the sponsor booths in the break. Cloud and Area is a great one that was mentioned in Tim's talk. So yeah, go check them out and any other ones that you're interested in. But thank you so much for watching.
Awesome.